Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, 79 years ago, a fiery bus crash killed most of the members of the Spokane Indians traveling baseball team. One of the few survivors went on to become a legend in Jacksonville sports history. We talked to the author of a new book about the tragedy and its impact. Later in the program, how the Live Wildly Music Showcase is benefiting conservation on the First Coast. But first, Hank Aaron called him the greatest manager I ever played for. The former Jacksonville Braves manager, Ben Garrity, is just one character in a new book by Eric Vickery, who joins me now by video. Good morning, Eric.
Good morning, Ann. Great to be here.
Great to have you, and thank you so much for joining us from Pacific time, which I'm sure is an eon away, but thank you for getting up early to do this. So, Eric, you were a sports writer, a baseball writer, in fact, when you learned what happened to the Spokane Indians in 1946. How did you first learn about this?
Yeah, I was actually researching a totally unrelated topic from 1946. There was a player named John Leovich who played for the Bremerton Blue Jackets, a team near Seattle, and I was researching his career for an article I was writing, and I came across a newspaper headline that described this horrific bus crash involving the Spokane Indians in the Cascade Mountains. And the details of the accident really struck me, and being a lifelong baseball fan, I was surprised that I had never heard of this accident. So I set out to kind of learn as much as I could and realized there was a lot more to the story, so that's how I ended up writing the book.
And so you started digging into this story, and as you say, it was a horrific accident. I believe it's still categorized as the worst in U.S. sports history. So tell us the details of what happened in that accident.
Yeah, so on June 24th, 1946, the team was traveling west across Washington State for the team's next series in Bremerton. And about halfway to Seattle, where they would then cross a ferry to Bremerton, the team bus, which was carrying 15 players, as well as the bus driver, met an oncoming vehicle near Snoqualmie Pass at an elevation of about 3,000 feet. That forced the bus to the side of the road. The bus driver lost control of the bus, and it ultimately broke through a cable guard wire and tumbled down this steep ravine about 300 feet. The bus caught fire as it rolled and then came to rest about 300 feet below the road. And of the 15 players on board, 9 died as a result of the accident. 6 players survived, as well as the bus driver.
And so 9 men died. 6 of them died instantly. Many others were injured with terrible burns. But Ben Garrity was one of the survivors. Tell us a little bit about how he managed to survive that accident and what he did immediately after to sort of help the other players that were in such a dire circumstance.
Yeah, so Ben was one of several players who was thrown from the bus when the accident occurred. And he actually was knocked unconscious, kind of sort of came to and saw the bus down below burning, and kind of gathered his wits and climbed back up to the highway and flagged down some passersby to ask for help. Ben had a broken kneecap and as well as a pretty severe head injury as a result of the accident. So he was hospitalized for a few days and then was released and tried to actually come back and manage the team that year, but because of his injuries was unable to do that for the rest of the season.
So he was 33 at the time of this accident. He told the Associated Press the day after the crash, as you note in your book, "I guess I'm pretty lucky. I was thrown right out a window, and I took the window frame right with me." But he was knocked out, so he didn't remember kind of how that happened, but he woke up, I guess, in the window of this bus that had ripped out during the crash.
That's right, yeah. Ben did remember describing seeing this the headlights of an oncoming vehicle sort of forcing the bus to the side of the road, and then he remembered going off the edge, and then next thing he knew, he kind of woke up having been thrown from the bus.
So
quite remarkable.
Yeah, this incident inspired a novel in 2006 called Until the End of the Ninth, which was partly inspired by that tragedy and sort of tracks it. But this is the first time this has been recounted in a nonfiction piece like this. Your book, The Season of Shattered Dreams, it looks at a whole period of baseball in a very interesting lens. I mean, this terrible accident is a animating moment, to kind of get us into the story. But you look at the whole environment of post World War II America, the challenges that a lot of these ball players were facing as they returned from war, and you focus on three individuals in particular. Ben Garrity is a local known name here to some, but tell us a little bit about him for people in this area who may not know who he is.
Sure. Ben was born in Brooklyn, New York, and grew up a big athlete, played basketball. That was actually his best sport, was basketball and baseball, and then attended Villanova University, actually studied journalism there, and was a highly successful baseball player there. And that attracted the attention of the Brooklyn Dodgers, who signed him as a college senior. And so Ben went straight from college to the major leagues, which is quite unusual. He sort of skipped the minor leagues his first year and played under Casey Stengel with the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1936. So that was his first taste of the major leagues. And Ben sort of quickly realized that he didn't have what it took to stick in the major leagues as a player. He did pretty well his first couple weeks, but then his batting average dipped to below 200. And so ultimately he realized that his future in the game was going to be as a coach or manager. And so playing for Casey Stengel, one of the all-time great managers in the game, he sort of set out to learn as much as he could about Stengel, would stay up late at night just talking baseball with him. Ben, after that first season, sort of bounced around the minor leagues for a few years and was actually working at a airplane factory in California during the war when Casey Stengel recruited him back to the Boston Braves for a couple more seasons in the major leagues during the war. And he was sort of just hanging on to the last of his playing career in 1946 with the Spokane Indians when this accident occurred.
If you're just joining us, we are talking about a new book about the tragic bus crash that decimated the Spokane Indians baseball team, a story with a Jacksonville connection. You can join our conversation on air by calling 904-549-2937, or you can email comments or questions to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. So I mentioned, Eric, you tell this story largely through three of the teammates, two of whom survived this crash and one who didn't. One of the other survivors, his name is Jack Lorkey, and he really had a remarkable life story even before surviving this accident. Tell us about him and just kind of his almost cinematic life story.
Yeah, Jack's story really is almost made for Hollywood. He grew up in Los Angeles and signed with San Diego Padres of the Pacific Coast League out of high school, but then was sent to fight overseas during the war and actually fought in the Battle of the Bulge. Survived the war and then actually returned home, sailed back to New York, and then was about to take the first flight of his life back home to California when he was bumped off the airplane by a higher-ranking officer. And then the plane later stopped to refuel in Kansas City and crashed. So Jack had already survived the war and survived this near plane crash in 1946 when he joined the Spokane Indians. And he was actually pulled off the bus about an hour before it crashed when he got a message, actually it was relayed from the State Patrol, that the San Diego Padres were calling him back up to the Pacific Coast League. So Jack said goodbye to his teammates and hitchhiked back to Spokane, and it was just an hour later that this crash occurred. And then he earned the earned nickname Lucky Lorkey after the accident.
And that was a nickname that he had some trouble accepting, right? I mean, he had survived, as you say,
Yes.
landed in Normandy, survived the Battle of the Bulge, survived a plane, avoiding a plane crash and then avoiding this terrible bus crash.
Yeah, definitely a well-earned nickname, but one he was never comfortable with. But it sort of rolled off the tongue and stuck. Even in the baseball encyclopedia when it was first printed in the 1960s, he's not listed as Jack Lorkey, he's listed as Lucky Lorkey. So it was the name that just sort of stuck with him. But you can imagine why he was uncomfortable with it, because it was a constant reminder of his friends who didn't make it.
Sure. So Ben moved on eventually to have a really strong Jacksonville connection. Ben Garrity, if people have been to the baseball stadium here in Jacksonville, they've probably seen his plaque that's dedicated to him. But Catch us up on what Ben Garrity meant when he was in Jacksonville and his connection to Hank Aaron.
Sure. So Ben was hired by the Milwaukee Braves to manage in their minor league system, and in 1951 was promoted up to Jacksonville, who were then a affiliate of the Giants for the first couple of years, but then they sort of switched affiliations to the Braves. So in 1953, Ben was managing the Jacksonville Braves, and on that team was Hank Aaron, as well as Horace Garner and Felix Mantilla. And those were the first black players to play in the South Atlantic League. So they integrated the league that year with Ben Garrity as their manager. And Ben, in his 6 seasons in Jacksonville between 51 and 57, the team finished in first or second place 5 out of those 6 seasons. So very successful run. And by all accounts, as you mentioned, Hank Aaron called him the greatest manager he ever played for, and perhaps the greatest manager who ever lived. So very high praise for Ben.
And Hank Aaron was just 19 when he was playing under Ben Garrity. He said in one quote, he chewed me out when I needed it, but he taught me how good I could be. And most important, he taught me how to study the game and never make the same mistake twice. So as you say, that South Atlantic League was where this minor league color barrier was broken, sometimes called the Sally League. It was a tough league to play in for Hank Aaron and for the other teammates of color.
It was. That was at a period in time where the black players were unable to eat at the same restaurants as their teammates. They were not able to stay at the same hotels. So Ben would often visit those players at the hotel or eat with them in the bus because they were not able to go inside the restaurant. So it was a difficult time for those players. They endured a lot of racist taunts and things from fans as well as opposing teams. But they had full support from their manager, and Hank Aaron actually ended up being the MVP of the league that year. Had a very successful season. Of course, that propelled him on his way to a Hall of Fame major league career.
And Hank Aaron, I believe, really credited Ben Garrity with sticking up for the team when they were being discriminated against, would challenge restaurant owners or accompany them to a different restaurant so as not to kind of facilitate or participate in that racist attitude.
Absolutely, yeah. Ben had full support of his players, and Hank Aaron actually wrote about that in his autobiography about Aaron that year. So it was an important time in our country's history as things were changing, and people like Hank Aaron certainly needed a man like Ben Garrity to help him navigate those difficult circumstances.
So Ben Garrity's grandnephew actually wrote a long essay about Ben Garrity for the Jackson, which is a local publication here. And I reached out to him and his father. They weren't able to join us today, but they said that, those memories were really powerful for the family, that they regarded Ben Garrity very much as a hero. And there is, in fact, as I said, a plaque at the 121 Financial Ballpark here in Jacksonville that honors Ben Garrity as one of the legends of Jacksonville baseball. He won 4 pennants, I guess, or 1 pennant over 4 years. Is that right? And was then the minor league manager of the year twice.
That's right, yeah. And then ultimately was promoted up to AAA. And so got very close to managing in the major leagues. That was ultimately his goal, but never reached that goal. And part of that was because the Braves, he was so good at sort of teaching players in the minor leagues and fostering them along in their careers that they wanted him to stay in the minors and continue in that role. And Ben actually came back to Jacksonville in the early 60s when the team was an affiliate of the Cleveland Indians, and then managed for a couple more seasons in Jacksonville at that time before his death.
So this accident that kind of begins this book also in many ways shapes the life of the men who survived the accident and really had an impact on them. Talk a little bit about how Ben Garrity was affected throughout his life by the trauma of that accident.
Yeah, so Ben's goal, as I mentioned, was to manage in the major leagues, and in order to do that, traveled in buses throughout his minor league managerial career. This is before most teams traveled by airplane, so he coped with that in part with alcohol, and he would sit right behind the bus driver. And in Pat Jordan's book, A False Spring, he described Ben as being just sort of hyper aware and sitting right behind the bus driver, sort of anxiously making sure they got to their destination. So in some ways it was probably what we call today post-traumatic stress disorder. So Ben lived with that throughout his life and coped with using alcohol, which probably had some detrimental effects on his health. So the crash no doubt affected the rest of his baseball career as well as his life in general.
And his alcohol problem was really widely known. I mean, it was something that affected him and his family and his players, that it was not something that was, a hidden problem that he had.
That's right. Yeah, I was able to interview 6 players who played for Ben during their careers in the 50s and early 60s, and they all alluded to Ben certainly liking his beer and drinking, in the clubhouse after games, which was very commonplace at that time. But certainly Ben, probably drank more than most, and that certainly had some negative impacts on his health. He missed actually a season because of stomach ulcers in the late 50s, and then had some more health complications in her first year back in Jacksonville in '61.
So I want to show a picture of the book, Season of Shattered Dreams. As I mentioned, you focus largely on 3 people related to that accident. And one of them was Vic Passetti, who was on the bus, and he didn't survive. Why did you choose him as someone you wanted to focus on as well?
Yeah, so Vic Pachetti was an 18-year-old out of San Francisco, and by all accounts, he was the best prospect on the team. He was also the youngest player on the team. And I was able to track down descendants of Vic, his nieces, who have a wealth of information in scrapbooks, letters, photographs, newspaper documents, all of this sort of documenting Vic's early life growing up in San Francisco. He was a highly successful high school athlete, was chosen to participate in this All-American game at the Polo Grounds in New York, where he played for Mel Ott and against Connie Mack, and among his teammates was Richie Ashburn. So even at age 16, he had already achieved quite a bit, and then was recruited by all major league teams and ultimately decided to sign with the Oakland Oaks under Casey Stengel. Casey Stengel actually sent Vic to Spokane in 1946 to gain more experience. That's how he ended up with the Spokane Indians in '46. So Vic, even though he was the youngest player on the team, had already accomplished a lot in his baseball career and probably had the highest ceiling in terms of future as a major league prospect. So I thought his story was very interesting, and certainly that's why I chose to focus on that in the book.
Yeah, and he was just 18 at the time. Did you find that the families were gratified to have you digging into this story that, as you say, like even as a baseball writer, was something that you had not known about and really was sort of largely forgotten?
Absolutely, yeah. I found that many of the family members I contacted were very happy that their relative stories were coming to light. Players like Vic Pachetti and Bob Patterson, another player who was killed, a great prospect. These were players who were on their way up, and they sort of just disappeared from the baseball landscape. The accident was reported in newspapers across the country immediately afterwards. And then occasionally on anniversaries, like 10 years after, 20 years after, there'd be an article in the papers. But now, close to 80 years later, these stories had all pretty much faded from our collective consciousness. So the families were very happy that these stories are kind of finally coming to light and that their family members would be remembered in this way.
It's not just Lucky Lorkey that had a very cinematic life. This book really seems like it's got cinematic potential. Is there any interest that you've heard from anybody in terms of turning this story into a film?
Well, I've heard that a lot from people who read the book, and even sort of writing in and seeing all the interesting facets of the story, and of course the time period, being after World War II. It's a fascinating time in our country's history. As we talked about, Jack Lorkey's crazy life story is truly fascinating. I haven't been approached by anyone, but I certainly think it could make a great film, and maybe that'll happen someday.
And people can get this book. Is it available just on Amazon, Eric, or do you know if it's available locally here in Jacksonville?
Yeah, it's not widely available in bookstores. It's I think most people will find it online, Amazon, or through my publisher, Roman in Littlefield, which is ROWMAN, Roman.com.
All right. Well, Eric Vickery, it's a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for writing the book. Thanks so much for coming on to talk about it.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.